Morning, everybody, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever in the world you are. Thank you very much for joining this Zoom presentation. This is the week of the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Coral Sea, which occurred, of course, to Australia's north. And it's a very significant date in naval history as well as Australian history. As you will have seen from the flyer, I'm going to be talking about not only the Battle of the Coral Sea, but also the Battle of Midway, which occurred within a month or a little over a month afterwards. And in many ways, I do this because I think of the two battles as round one and round two of the same fight. And as with all fights, what happens to begin with often determines what happens in the end of the fight. And this is very true of the relationship between Coral Sea and Midway. So 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Coral Sea was fought. It wasn't seen as being a victory for either side at the time, but of course we know in retrospect that it was a major victory, tactically not a victory, but strategically very much one. We have to go back in time to understand the genesis of all this. As you can see, after building their first aircraft carrier in 1918, Japan came out of World War I with an entitlement to build small carriers and develop aviation under the terms of the Washington Treaty. The 5-5-3 ratio that they were allowed in battleships was also applied to cruisers and destroyers, but they were not happy with that, and they built more carriers from their cruisers that they had under construction. Half-constructed dreadnoughts became large aircraft carriers, and you can see there that the Japanese were very innovative in turning half-completed battle cruisers into carriers with short flight decks. Akagi and Cargo are both laid down as heavy cruisers, and you can see there the bow shape that was clearly intended for a different vessel, heavy cruisers. The Washington Treaty authorized the conversion of 2 battleships or battle cruiser hulls into aircraft carriers up to 33,000 tons, and Cargo was selected for completion as an aircraft carrier. There became a very serious national commitment to naval aviation. It was seen as the coming way of war at sea, and many people became very passionate about ensuring that Japan didn't get left behind. Then the IJN carrier program in its own right started after the withdrawal from the International Naval Agreement in 1936, and a world-beating fleet that would push the Western powers out of Asia was designed and built, and the 2 products of that in the late 1930s were Hiryu and Soryu. There they are there. All-metal monoplanes began to transform aviation and to threaten battleships and both the RN and USN carriers from the air. That was the first time in naval history that that had happened. And the strike power of the carrier came of age as aircraft improved. It became obvious that they were much more potent than the biplanes of the earlier era. The Mitsubishi Zero, for example, in early combat, the Zero gained a legendary reputation as a dogfighter. Later on in the war, it was outclassed, but to begin with, it was an aircraft that was second to none. It had a high ceiling for its day, could climb fast, and it had powerful armament and could be equipped with bombs as well as being a fighter. So it had it all, really. The Navy pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor in December 41, most of them had had 800 hours of flying experience. They were very good indeed, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They'd practiced and perfected the art of getting in low and doing what had to be done in their aircraft. There they are there, the state of the art for 1940-41. And of course, the torpedo that they carried was superior in both range and reliability, particularly the latter, to either the United States Navy or the Royal Navy equivalents. The Long Lance torpedo was fast, it was accurate, it had a powerful warhead, and it devastated the hulls of ships that it struck against, whether from the air or from sea level. Indeed, at the Battle of the Java Sea, torpedoes being fired by enemy warships from so far off that the suspicion was that there must be Japanese submarines inside the destroyer screen of the Allied force. It wasn't, it was just the Long Lance torpedo was superior to anything that the Abda forces had come across. Of course, the battleship was still seen by many, particularly senior Japanese admirals, as being the only capital ship. The saying in the West was that only battleships can do it in dirty weather and do it at night. But that became increasingly less true. What you have to remember is that Alfred Thayer Mahan was not just a huge influence on the Kaiser before World War I, he was also an enormous influence on the Japanese, who adopted his techniques and won at the Battle of Tsushima, and thereafter were wedded to the idea that the capital ship, the battleship, was the war-winning weapon that Japan had to have. And of course, they went on, as we know, building them. And in 1937, they laid down 2 giant Yamato-class battleships, built secretly, built with 18-inch guns to outgun the United States Navy, particularly as no ship of the USN that was broad enough in the beam to carry 18-inch armament was going to be able to get through the Panama Canal. So the Japanese put a lot of faith in the idea that their battleships, Yamato and Musashi, were going to be able to take out American ones before the Americans could get in range. Not everyone was convinced. Captain Genda, who was an air power advocate, and he helped Yamato plan Pearl Harbor. He said, build aircraft carriers, not battleships. The battleships are only good for being turned into piers at the end of dockyards. But unfortunately for the Japanese, he was a junior officer and he didn't have the clout to get his ideas passed. Nevertheless, there were very powerful new carriers coming off the production line, the Shokaku and the Zuka class, both fast, capable of 34 knots. At the time that they were built, probably the best, most capable aircraft carriers in the world. Certainly, they outclassed anything that the Royal Navy or United States Navy had in the Pacific, which of course is where the Japanese planned to fight their battles. They didn't ignore other classes of ship, of course. There were fast escorts to protect the carriers. There's Maya, one of the cruisers that encircled HMAS Yarra with her heroic Captain Robert Rankin. And unfortunately, of course, Rankin was lost along with his ship. And I want to pay particular tribute to the fact that I know his daughter, Patricia, is online with us from Canada at the moment. There's Maya there. And Lieutenant Rankin had no chance against guns of that caliber. Here's a snapshot of what the Japanese had in 1941 before they went to war. 12 battleships, 15 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 5 escort carriers, 18 heavy cruisers, 25 light cruisers, and 169 destroyers. That's a powerful fleet. This was the Navy which inspired confidence in the Naval General Staff that a short, successful war could be fought in the Pacific. Of course, the United States Navy was also building. In the early 1930s, they had the Enterprise class with large armored flight decks, and they were very good indeed. But the armor wasn't complete and it wasn't thick enough, as we find out later on in this program. They were large, they were capable, and they were good aircraft carriers, no question about it. The USN exercised its carriers and its battle fleet together. They integrated them with cruisers. Every year they did exercise till they had confidence in operating together. New aircraft made them a very formidable threat to any adversary. But of course, more carriers and more aircraft were needed than anybody imagined. Fleet Admiral Yamamoto had been in America during his junior years as an officer, and he knew full well the scale of American production and what it was capable of achieving if it was ever pushed to do so. And he said famously before the war, in the first 6 to 12 months, I will run wild and win victory after victory. But then if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. And of course, that proved to be absolutely prophetic. On the 4th of December, 41, there was an imperial conference which took the decision in Tokyo to go to war. And at the same time, negotiations were still continuing in Washington, which of course is why Roosevelt calls it a date that will live in infamy. The combined fleet was already on its way to Hawaii while these discussions were taking place. And as you know, in 1941, in December, the capital ships were the primary target. This was the Mahanian emphasis still coming through. The Royal Navy raid on Taranto, which crippled Italy's navy, was Yamamoto's model for Pearl Harbor. The Japanese naval attaché in Rome went down to see the damage that had been done at Taranto and came back and said, if the British can do that with biplanes, we can surely do something much more dramatic with our fast all-metal monoplanes. But you can look at Pearl Harbor and say it was a failure of Japanese intelligence. They expected 4 carriers to be there, and they expected to sink them all, and they found none in Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December. Only Lexington and Enterprise were based at Pearl normally. Hornet and Yorktown were in the Atlantic, so that really was a failure of intelligence. The other great failure from the Japanese point, of course, was that they failed to destroy the docks and the fuel tanks. That was a serious blunder because it could be revived as a naval base very quickly after the loss of the battleships in the harbor in the lineup there. Nagumo, who was in charge, ignored the urgings of his staff officers to launch a second attack on the oil farm and the docks. He really didn't believe in Yamamoto's plan to destroy the USN's ability. But bear in mind what I just said about his failure to launch a second attack, because that will become very relevant later in our story. Navy and Army aircraft at Hickam Field were destroyed, but most US pilots were not in combat, so they survived. They were eager for revenge, and of course their aircraft could be quickly replaced from the United States by much better ones. So the disaster that occurred was a limited disaster compared with what it might have been. Of course, it wasn't limited in any way for those who lost their lives there. USS Enterprise, the Big E, was not at Pearl Harbor. That was very significant because Enterprise goes on to be the backbone of the Pacific War until she's replaced by more modern Essex-class carriers later in the war. Enterprise and Lexington and their air groups remained at large in the Pacific, and they were not searched for after the attack, as would have been logical for them to have, the Japanese to have done so. Yorktown and Hornet were quickly sailed through the Panama Canal from the Atlantic to join Enterprise and Lexington, which brought Nimitz, the commander-in-chief, up to 4 carriers in the Pacific by March 42. And there they are there, Yorktown, Hornet, Enterprise, and Lexington, equipped with dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. A formidable force. And Saratoga joined them with Wasp and Ranger as well. In 1941, some in the Navy General Staff in Tokyo argued that the siege of a port should be carried out by a small landing force in Australia, because Northern Australia was pretty much undefended. It appeared to the Japanese to be very isolated from main cities. But there was no support for this proposal within the army. And Yamamoto consistently opposed the idea. It was no part of his plan to end up having to defend or fight for Australian ports. And we know that this is the case because Prime Minister of Imperial Japan, Hideki Tojo, at his war crimes trial said, "We never had enough troops to invade Australia. We did not have the arms strength or the supply facilities to mount such a terrific extension of our already overstrained and too thinly spread forces. We expected to occupy all of New Guinea, to maintain Rabaul, and to raid Northern Australia by air, but actual physical invasion, no, at no time." However, part of the plan, of course, was to neutralize Australia, and the attack on Darwin by 188 aircraft from the carriers and from Rabaul in the 19th of February, and the subsequent attacks, was intended to do just that. There wasn't really enough infrastructure in Darwin or in the ships in the harbor to justify the amount of naval air power. I consider it a psychological operation to convince the Australian government that the support for basing of an American fleet in Darwin would be too costly, and the expectation was that they would be withdrawing from the war. Nagumo's force carriers that hit Pearl Harbor did the raid on Darwin, supplemented by bombers from Rabaul. So it was a very significant strike force that was mustered, as I say, disproportionate to the significance of the naval and military forces at Darwin. Partly a psychological operation, and there's the powerful Kaga that was there, more of her later. Here's Tsuruyo off Darwin. The intention, as I say, was that Australia would ask for an armistice and withdraw from the war in the Pacific, and the Americans would have no place from which to base a fleet for a retaliatory strike against Japan after Pearl Harbor. There they are, Haruyo and Shokaku, 2 of the 5 fleet carriers, went through after the Darwin operation for the Ceylon operation the following month, March 1942. They attacked Colombo, sinking 2 ships in harbor and severely damaging support facilities. The task force also found and fought the RN carrier Hermes and the 2 Australian destroyers that were there, 1 Australian destroyer. This is the plan for Japan for 1942. It does not involve Sumatra. It does not involve Ceylon. What they were looking for was bases in the Solomons, Port Moresby, New Caledonia, and Fiji. That would have been sufficient to have kept the Americans out of the Pacific. However, the temptation to go into the Indian Ocean was just too great. And so they went in with that big carrier force, some in Japanese high command wanted to return after Hermes had been sunk and to put an invasion force ashore. Yamamoto was consistently opposed to it and said, no, the thing we have to do is to sink the US carrier fleet at Midway before they start striking us. There's Vampire, our lost destroyer, still not found. There's Prince of Wales and Repulse under attack in December 41. And of course, with the sinking of Hermes, the Japanese air arm got what's called victory disease. They came to believe that their fleet was so powerful that caution and good intelligence were unnecessary because the risks were so low. They paid for that hubris at Midway. The 2 RN carriers Dorsetshire and Cornwall were both sunk by carrier torpedo aircraft off Ceylon on the 5th of April 42. That was a tragedy for the Royal Navy, those 2 heavy cruisers, the same class as Australia and Canberra. So here's the plan for 1942. Yamamoto would not agree to defer it. He feared all other landing operations would be disrupted by US carrier forces still at large. His priority was the sinking of those forces. The Japanese plan for Midway assumed that the USN carriers could be lured into a battle coming out of Pearl and surprised and sunk defending Midway. Guam and Wake had already fallen to the Japanese. The Japanese believed that they couldn't imagine the Americans not fighting to defend Midway as well. So that was the plan. While all this planning was going on, Doolittle, flying off Hornet, and his Army Air Corps airmen took off with B-25s on the so-called Doolittle raid. And it did very little damage materially when it arrived over Japan, but psychologically it was a huge blow. Yamamoto felt humiliated that the Emperor's city had been attacked, and he was determined to eliminate wherever the carrier-borne strike force had come from so that there could never again be a raid on Japan from the Americans. Little did he know what the future held. The tragedy was, of course, that 250,000 Chinese lives were lost in reprisals when the bombers landed in China, and the Japanese went about systematically massacring anyone, whether they had any connection to the Doolittle raid or not in China. It confirmed that the Midway plan was the only way to defend the homeland. Now, by April, USS Yorktown is based at Pearl, waiting for Singpak's orders. She's there with her sister ships. Where are the Japanese going to come? Where's the strike going to be? Well, of course, the Operation Hypo, or Station Hypo, was busy trying to decipher that, and we'll come to that in a moment. Admiral Inoue's orders were to take Port Moresby, turn it into a southern bastion of the Japanese Empire from which to control Torres Strait first, and then subsequently the Coral Sea all the way out to New Caledonia, to make it a Japanese-only area. That was the plan. And of course, listening in and making very good progress with decoding and decrypting was Fromell. This was the Fleet Radio Unit in Melbourne, was a joint RAN and USN capability, led by the famous Lieutenant, later Captain Eric Nave. They were decoding signal traffic, and they became convinced that the Americans had Port Moresby, not New Caledonia, as the next target for a Japanese amphibious assault. Then they had to convince MacArthur of that, but they succeeded in doing so, and MacArthur in turn convinced American High Command. On this basis, Nimitz, who's Singpak, ordered Task Force 17 to be built around the carriers Lexington and Yorktown and to rendezvous with all available US and Australian warships in the Coral Sea. And it was this prevision, it was Fromell that made the difference. If the carriers had not been available, and stationed in the Coral Sea, then the Battle of the Coral Sea would not have occurred and Port Moresby would have fallen. Fletcher was the aviator and he was trusted by Nimitz to hold the line in the Coral Sea until his preferred admiral, Bull Halsey, could get there with Hornet and Enterprise. But Hornet had just been involved in the Doolittle raid, had to go back to Pearl before she could come south again, and that meant that Halsey could not arrive in time for the battle. So Fletcher had the job, and he only had 2 carriers against the 3 that the Japanese were going to put into the battle. That was not enough for a clear victory. The Japanese first plan for controlling the Coral Sea was to take the island of Tulagi in the Solomons Group and put a seaplane base there so that they'd have good eyes in the sky to know what was happening in the area. Aryan coast watchers warned the Americans that an invasion force was heading for Tulagi, and the Americans were able to launch from Yorktown a strike. 60 aircraft took off and made 2 raids, and they only sank 1 destroyer and 3 minesweepers because their torpedoes didn't explode. They also succeeded in shooting up and destroying 4 reconnaissance aircraft. So that wasn't a great success, except that the loss of those aircraft and the lack of radar blinded the Japanese commanders during the first days of the week of battle that was to follow. So it wasn't without consequence, but it wasn't anything like the success it should have been either. But what it did do was alert the Japanese to the fact that there must be a carrier somewhere in the Coral Sea. So Admiral Takagi, who was in the command of the main Japanese task force, ordered airstrikes once the US carrier had been found. He didn't know how many there were. And of course, that is the beginning of the Battle of the Coral Sea. Now, every detail in this battle would take too long to go through, so I'll just do the main points. On the 7th of May, the force that took off looking for a carrier came across the USS Neosho and the destroyer Sims, and they were eventually attacked by 36 dive bombers, which was a disproportionate use of Japanese aircraft against what were really secondary targets. Neosho had also already refueled the fleet. There was a heavy loss of life, but you couldn't say there was any loss of airstrike capability. And of course, it did alert the Americans pretty much to where to go looking for the main Japanese carrier force. It also alerted them to the fact that there was an urgent requirement to block the Jomard Passage, because if there was to be an amphibious landing on Port Moresby, it would have to come through that Jomard Passage in order to get to Port Moresby by any logical means. So Fletcher detached what he called Task Force 17.5, that should read, and that was under the command of the famous Rear Admiral Jack Crace, Royal Navy, who was an Australian by birth, was here as our fleet commander, and he was at sea in his flagship HMAS Australia. He went north by west and blocked the Jomard Passage to the troop transports which would have to pass through there. His captain was the Harold Farncombe, who goes on to be one of our first admirals. He was an excellent ship handler. When the Japanese bombers arrived, there was no top cover for them. Fletcher couldn't spare any aircraft to look after this little task force, and so it relied on excellent ship handling. And all 3 COs of the main ship force there were particularly good. Everyone on board Farncombe, everybody on board Australia realized that Farncombe had saved the ship because he kept combing torpedoes as they came in. Very successful at avoiding it. At one stage, the other ships saw the water spout so high over Australia that they assumed she'd been hit and lost. So did the Japanese. USS Chicago was a heavy cruiser under Crace's command. She was bombed and attacked with torpedoes, but again, not hit. She put up a very heavy screen of anti-aircraft fire and shot down bombers and deterred others from coming in. It's a pretty alarming sight when you can see that bombers are being knocked out of the sky around you if you're a Japanese incoming bomber pilot. The vulnerability to torpedo attack was extreme, and there was an element of luck in the fact that these ships weren't hit in the same way that Prince of Wales and Repulse had been in December 41. The other hero of the hour was Captain Harry Howden, much underestimated by many, but a very, very successful captain. He was lying back in a deck chair on the bridge of his ship Hobart, watching with binoculars the bombers coming in and giving us helm orders accordingly and dodging bombs as they came down. There were 19 heavy bombers attacked Hobart, and Hobart shot down 3 of them, a pretty good record in those days. Misinformation and misidentification. The Japanese pilots went back and told the Japanese command in Rabaul that they had sunk a California-class battleship, damaged another, and a cruiser. In reality, Crace's ships were undamaged, and they'd shot down 8 torpedo bombers. At this point, having asked for air cover, bombers arrived from Townsville, B-17s, and they mistakenly bombed the task force 17.5, but caused no damage. Fletcher was furious, but did comment on the fact that the Americans' aim was worse than the Japanese. Before dawn on the 8th of May, both the Japanese and the American carriers sent out their scouts, and these both made contact a few hours later, and the Japanese got the strike in first. The Americans launched at about 9 o'clock, and each side attacked the other's ships at about 11 a.m. Shoho was found. She was the light carrier that was supposed to be escorting the troop convoy through the Jomard Passage. She was set on fire by Yorktown's dive bombers, and of course slowed down to the point where she was an easy target for Lexington's air group coming in with their torpedoes. Those ones worked, and Yorktown's SPD squadron commander radioed famously, "Scratch one flat top." Very significantly, 638 Japanese airmen and their maintenance crews died in Shoho. This becomes very significant. 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes ignited aviation fuel, and ammunition exploded, and she turned into a living hell. And it's easy to see why so many experienced pilots died in that inferno. Carrier training was a long process, and the Japanese never found a solution to the loss of trained pilots. Shoho had been the only escort carrier for the invasion force. She was sunk at 11:35 on the 8th of May, and that meant there was no air cover for the Port Moresby troop ships coming from Rabaul. The risk of taking him through Jomard was now considered too great by Admiral Inoue, and he postponed his invasion. Next came the attacks on Shokaku and Zuka on the 8th of May. The dive bombers went in. They hit Shokaku with 3,000-pound bombs, tearing open the forecastle and causing heavy damage to the carrier's flight and hangar decks. There's the damage you can see there, and 223 of her crew were killed or wounded. There were explosions in her fuel tank and workshops. She wasn't sunk. She withdrew from the battle, heading for Truk for repairs. But she was out of the fight, not just out of the Battle of the Coral Sea, but out of the fight for months to come. Lexington was then penetrated by bombs through her flight deck, which started fires and was hit by 2 torpedoes. And Yorktown took a single bomb strike. Here's a Japanese image of what it looked like attacking Lexington as seen by a Japanese pilot. Lexington was listing and crippled. There was really no choice but to abandon ship, but 2,700 ship's company, including maintainers and aircrew, was saved to serve on and fight another day. That was a significant victory from what is obviously a devastating loss in terms of capability. There's the ship's company abandoning ship as gasoline vapor ignites the fire, which would soon become uncontrollable. Damage from near misses had so distorted her hull that her lifts were stuck in the up position, and there was no way that she could continue to serve. Lexington's loss was a serious blow to Nimitz' plans to maintain maximum carrier strength in the Pacific. But as I said, her pilots and her aircraft were saved. They flew over to Yorktown and landed on her deck to fight another day. If there hadn't been 2 carriers in the battle, of course, all those aircraft would also have been lost as well. So at this point, the Japanese decide they've had enough and they start to withdraw. When the surviving aircraft from all ships, including Shoho, landed on the unscathed Zuka, there were only 39 operational aircraft, and 24 of those were Zero fighters. So they were of no particular significance in terms of taking out American ships. There were too few bombers to continue the battle, and their ships were too low on fuel, so it's time to pull out and withdraw. And so they did. Well, what can we say about the result of this battle? The target in the Southwest Pacific for May 42 was Port Moresby. They failed to take it. And so that chart makes it fairly obvious what was intended. And without the sea lines being closed, it was possible to reinforce Port Moresby. The outcome of the battle for Crace, he had deterred, and not repulsed, but deterred a very powerful invasion force. Japan had really suffered its first major strategic defeat in the Pacific War. Crace's force rather got forgotten by Fletcher. He didn't get any orders because of radio silence. He continued to patrol the Jomard Passage until he realized that he was getting low on fuel, and he returned to Australia. There's the outcome. Both carrier forces lost one carrier, Shoho and Lexington. And you can see there are other losses as well, and the number of Japanese aircraft and the number of American aircraft were not dissimilar. That's why people said it was something of a draw at the time. But there's Port Moresby, basically defended by a bunch of boys from Australia who've been sent north there. Their elder brothers are all fighting elsewhere in the world or coming home to Australia. It was a very small garrison of inexperienced Australia militia troops. We know they went on and did spectacular things later on the Kokoda track. I'm not discounting them. What I am saying is the determined Japanese amphibious force, once it had got ashore in Port Moresby, would have dealt with them. But for whatever reason, Inoue didn't come back. There was nothing protecting the Coral Sea. There was nothing in the Jomard Passage. There was no reason why he shouldn't have made a run for it from Rabaul and got his forces ashore. He didn't do so. That was a strategic blunder, which leads on to Kokoda and Guadalcanal and the horrific fighting that was required by the Japanese to attempt and fail to establish themselves in the Southwest Pacific. He failed to press home the advantage gained by the sinking of Lexington and the damaging of Yorktown. Of course, the Japanese had a propaganda field day with this. They claimed that the USS California had been sunk, that Yorktown was sunk, that Saratoga was sunk. That was Lexington, of course. And then they also showed Hermes, Cornwall, Dorsetshire, Prince of Wales, and Repulse. And here's the Japanese turning up with more crosses to give to the Allies, Indian Ocean and the Coral Sea down at the bottom. The reality was far different. Yorktown was back in Pearl Harbor after Midway, having the damage to her repaired. She had been damaged, but she was getting repair first in Tonga and then back in Pearl. She was repaired by a round-the-clock effort. She re-embarked her squadrons and prepared for battle again. The Japanese were sure she was gone. That was significant. Enterprise was back, being ready for battle at Midway, and Nimitz could begin assembling whatever ships he could muster to meet the next threat from Japan. And that turned out to be very much what was required, because the Japanese Midway plan had not gone away. Neither Shokaku or Zuka were ready to deploy for the Midway operation. Zuka just lost too many pilots and aircraft, and as we saw, the damage to Shokaku's deck meant nothing was going to launch from her for months. So that was a very significant loss from the Japanese point of view. Shokaku entered dry dock in June 42, and there was nothing coming out of there until much after the Battle of Midway. The other thing to remember is that the best IGN combat pilots were not sent to train the next generation of pilots and given a break from combat, as happened with Western navies. They stayed in battle because they were the best until they were killed in action. So there was no intergenerational understanding that you hand on the great experience that has been gained in air combat rather than allow it to die with the pilot. Japanese flying training was very much a slow, hazardous business. It required fuel and available decks, and there was a critical shortage of fuel and also of decks that weren't engaged. So there was a lack of innovative thinking in how to simulate a deck ashore, which was the obvious solution. There were too many phases to the training. It all took too long to get wings, and there was a critical shortage of fuel. So they had a serious replacement problem. So let's turn to the Battle of Midway. As I indicated earlier, Yamamoto believed that the Americans would consider Midway a vital outpost of Pearl Harbor, would be compelled to defend it vigorously with their remaining carriers. That's why he believed he could set a trap. Midway was outside the effective range of almost all American aircraft based in the main Hawaiian Islands. So Yamamoto believed the Americans would have nothing on the island. That was a huge mistake to assume that, because it simply wasn't true. The exercise activities to test the battle plan were all tabletop maneuvers, and every time an activity occurred which was deemed by the umpire to result in the loss of Japanese ships and carriers, was overruled by the umpire, Admiral Ogaki. Consequently, the doubters as to whether this plan would work were overruled, and victory disease set in. Postponement of the operation was urged until both Shokaku and Zuka were available, but that was again vetoed by the aforementioned admiral. So the mobile force of the Japanese had at sea, not counting the battleships, just the mobile force, was 4 carriers, Kaga, Akaki, Tsuyuru, and Hiryu, and they had a whole bunch of battleships attached and in the rear as well, and they had all those submarines as well, and none of those actually got into the fight. There were a total of 13 submarines intended to form the Advanced Expeditionary Force to report on warships coming out of Hawaii, but they were there too late to see the carriers coming out of Pearl. So they played no real part in the battle, which was fortunate for the Americans. So there they are. There are the fleet admirals planning the battle. One has no idea what is about to happen. The other has a pretty good idea of what he's up against. Yamamoto went to sea, and therefore he was unable to break radio silence to pass on any intelligence he might have to his tactical commanders. He needed to be in Tokyo to do that, and he wasn't. Nimitz was in Pearl Harbor. He was able to control and pass on intelligence, a very significant difference between them. The other tactical significance, of course, of the battle fleet was the question arose as whether it was too valuable to be used in the operation. Yamamoto and Musashi had taken everything that the Japanese economy could throw at them to put to sea. The idea of them being lost to an American attack was just too much. The consequence was there were 3 other battleships with them. They were 300 miles behind the mobile tactical force, which raises the question as to what did they think they were going to be able to achieve if the carrier force got into trouble. Battleship anti-aircraft batteries were a vital asset in defending a carrier fleet. We've all seen images of the wall of flak that the American battleships and battle cruisers used to put up to defend carriers in 1944-45. The Japanese didn't see the battleship as being part of the integrated fleet, and that left the carriers very vulnerable indeed. By the time that Nimitz had to make final decisions on his dispositions, the Japanese plans and order of battle had largely been reconstructed from in Pearl in considerable detail, as much detail as was possible to get. And he was very good at listening to experts, no matter what their rank was, and he set his trap with very good knowledge of enemy intentions. How did he have this inside knowledge? Well, as most of you will know, it was through code breaking. The naval code breaker who's credited with the victory at Midway is Joe Rochford. There's the book about him, Joe Rochford's War. I recommend it to you. The Odyssey of the Codebreaker who outwitted Yamamoto at Midway. Rochford had failed to predict the attack on Pearl. He had a tremendous sense of guilt for what had happened there. He worked all the hours God sent. He worked from hypo, but he was also taking the decrypts from Fromell in Melbourne. In April, he noticed that the code AF was appearing in Japanese signal traffic as a destination. He wanted to know where AF was, and he suggested using an encrypted emergency warning in the hope of provoking a Japanese response and establishing where it was. He took the idea to Nimitz, who approved. The Midway garrison was told by submarine cable to radio in plain language an emergency request for water due to an explosion in the water desalination system. The Japanese, of course, heard the broadcast, gave instructions to load additional water desalination equipment for AF, for the troops they proposed to put there, and Rochford decoded it. And therefore, he knew that AF was the target. AF was Midway. That meant, of course, that Nimitz could overrule those who said, no, they're still coming for Pearl or even the west coast of the United States. He went to Midway and asked the commanders there, what do you need? And they said, well, we need a force in being, we need dive bombers, we need wildcats, You need the Army Air Corps B-17s. We need flying fortresses. Weren't very many of those yet. They got them. Navy flying boats, motor torpedo boats. Midway was turned into a Gibraltar of the Pacific. In fact, you could argue that it was the most powerfully defended piece of ground in the world at that time. So that was what was waiting for Nagumo. He had to prepare defenses against both US land attacks from Midway and sea-based air attacks. He didn't even know that yet, but there were B-26 flying fortresses waiting for him, carrier killer weapons on Midway, waiting to go into action. So this new capability was pretty decisive. If you look at what you're now faced with, it's better than it was at Coral Sea. You've got 3 aircraft carriers, Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, repaired against the Japanese 4 aircraft carriers, and you can see the rest of the order of battle there. But you've also got 115 land-based Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Force planes based on Midway. So the belief in Japan's invincibility and the underrating of American capabilities would be reflected in the planning and execution of the Japanese staff's Midway offensive, and that had very serious consequence. They planned, of all things, a simultaneous trip up to the Aleutian Islands with 2 light carriers and aircraft. Now, we used to believe that this was something that Yamamoto had planned in order to get the Americans to send their carriers north. In fact, recent research indicates that Yamamoto did not plan this. This was the idea of the Japanese High Command. It flew in the face of the whole principle of concentration of force to no great military purpose. These Alaskan islands are of no significance to anyone. In fact, Yamamoto opposed it, but was overruled and was told that he was only going to get permission for his plan for Midway if he agreed to this Aleutian plan and detached these 2 light carriers. Yamamoto had to agree to this plan in exchange for approval of his Midway plan. So the Aleutian plan went ahead, and that was not a clever idea. Dutch Harbor was attacked, shelled, and invaded, and Nimitz saw this happening and was urged, particularly by politicians, to do something about this American territory being invaded. He very coolly refused to allow his carriers to be diverted to the North Pacific because he knew exactly what was going on, and it worked out that this was some kind of a ruse. He refused to be drawn north. So there are 2 plans going on there. You can see the 2nd Mobile Task Group going up to Dutch Harbor, and you can see the 1st Mobile Task Force heading for Midway, and the Japanese carrier force coming in, the 2nd Fleet, and another force coming in with the actual occupation force there. So there's the battle plan. The USN required surprise and concentration of its own force if it was to avoid defeat. Nimitz decided to concentrate all 3 of his carriers in 2 task forces on the northern approaches to Midway Atoll, 1 under Fletcher, 1 under Spruance. He knew his carriers would be outnumbered by the Japanese, and many of his Navy aircrew had little or no actual combat experience. They were just going to have to do what they did. There were 5,000 Japanese troops under the command of Admiral Kondo, who thought they were going to go ashore more or less unchallenged on Midway. But of course, in order to make sure that that was the case, Midway was going to be softened up and eliminated as a potential source of resistance by Nagumo's bombers. Now, Yamamoto back in Yamato was monitoring the signal traffic, and he realized that there was an enormous amount of signal traffic dealing with Midway. He didn't know exactly what was being said, but he did know that the enemy must have become aware of the approach of our Japanese forces. That's his quote there. He didn't break silence to tell Nagumo because he didn't want to indicate to the Americans that there was a much larger force waiting to take out his carriers. That was still his plan. So Nagumo ends up heading for Midway, entirely unaware of the fact that there are any American carriers at sea. Nimitz's plan was to ambush the 1st Carrier Striking Force while its bombers were engaged in bombing Midway. Like Dutch Harbor, Midway was going to have to take it because that was the only way to maintain the secrecy. But that would only work if the surprise could be maintained by all other means. So Nagumo was basically steaming into a trap, unaware that the offensive was known about by his own admiral, but uncommunicated to him. So US Army Air Corps and US Marine Corps bombers attacked Kondo's fleet from Midway, once again with poor results. They found the invading force, failed to do it any great damage. These high-level bombers were simply not working. At dawn on the 4th of June, they went in and they took to the air from Midway. And that, of course, alerted the Japanese to the fact that there was a bomber force on Midway. They were now aware of that. But Midway's defenders were equally aware of the fact that there was about to be a bomb strike on them. Instead of being caught on the ground as they were in December at Pearl Harbor, they took to the air. And so when Nagumo's strike force came in, Wildcats and Buffaloes were in the air waiting for the raiders. That was very significant because defending Marine Corps fighters, aided by the anti-aircraft batteries down on the ground, shot down at least 40 Japanese aircraft, according to the Americans. They certainly got a fair number, and no US aircraft were caught on the ground. That was important because Nagumo decides that a second raid is needed. He's not going to make the same mistake he made with not raiding the oil farm at Pearl. He goes and orders another load of bombs be put onto the aircraft in his hangars, and they be readied for attack. That was, of course, an error of judgment on his part, because the change of ordnance below decks meant that bombs and torpedoes were stacked around hangars rather than stowed safely in magazines. And of course, his aircraft couldn't be got into the sky while they were having their aircraft, while they're having their payload changed. While this was going on, the Americans launched the very slow Douglas Devastator aircraft that they had waiting to go in. They launched them without air cover. This was a mistake. 26 went in, only 6 survived, no torpedo hits were scored. That was a terrible loss of life and aircraft, and reminds one, if one needed reminding, that when you've got a Mark I and a Mark II of something, don't use Mark I, don't use the slow version, use the aircraft, which, as we shall see shortly, were the most useful, which were the Dauntless dive bombers. So they went in, they were slaughtered by the Japanese Zeros waiting for them and by anti-aircraft fire coming up. And that was a tragedy, a preventable tragedy. Then the Dauntless bombers go in, take to the air after them, following in from where the Devastators had been lost. And this was much more significant. They had top cover. And it's true to say that if there's any one person who won the Battle of Midway for the Americans and for Nimitz and for his country, it was Lieutenant Commander Wade McCuskey. McCuskey was the one who Nimitz later said, if one man be said to win the battle and change the course of the war, it was Wade McCuskey. He decided to search beyond the range of his aircraft and correctly calculated the direction that search should take, and he won the Battle of Midway and turned the war against Japan. He observed the Japanese destroyer Arashi speeding in a northeasterly direction. McCluskey suspected the destroyer was one of Nagumo's carrier force screening the warships, and he followed it. Well, he followed it without attacking it, and then he flew along the bearing that destroyer was on. His dive bombers' fuel was reaching critical, and the prospect of all the dive bombers being able to return to Enterprise was remote. But despite that grave risk, he pressed on. He guessed the destroyer was following the carrier force. He went in, and despite that risk, and he found and devastated Kaga first. The US carriers were able to continue using his radio signals to put more aircraft in the air to back him up. So all 3 American Dauntless dive bomber squadrons arrived at perfect timing. Their locations and their altitudes were exactly right. And of course, they weren't attacked because the Japanese aircraft were mostly below decks. The Devastator's campaign, disastrous failed raid meant the Japanese aircraft were refueling and rearming for a second attack on Midway when 50 Dauntless dive bombers arrived. Luck, intuition, risk-taking, bravery. Enterprise Yorktown dive bombers go in. They devastate Akagi, Kaga, and Tsuruyu simultaneously, coming in from a great height. They were up against the anti-aircraft fire, but they were not up against top cover. And also there were torpedo enemy aircraft engaging the enemy fighters that were in the air, and the aircraft fire We were able to drop bombs on the enemy ships unimpeded, said McCuskey, and that was a very significant moment for him. There they are. Now, Nagumo now knew that he was under attack from at least one carrier, but he failed to understand the immediate need for speed. He ordered a slow change from bombs intended for Midway to torpedoes for the carriers. That took time. It has left his carriers unprotected from attack. He should have sent the bombers off to attack the carriers before they could launch that blast, and he should have ignored Midway and just got all his torpedo-carrying aircraft into the aircraft and got at the carriers quickly. Tsuruya was hit by Enterprise and Yorktown dive bombers, while her aircraft were also below decks being rearmed. Major mistake. And Nagumo said later, "We had no intelligence about the enemy. We never knew where or how many enemy carriers there were. We went into this operation without knowledge of our enemy." Well, that flies in the face of all the principles of war. There's a Kagi hit and left burning. And Nagumo himself transfers to a cruiser and informs Yamamoto that 3 of his carriers are now wrecked. The torpedo attack went in, and the dive bombers came out of a clear sky. It was the dive bombers that did most of the damage, not the torpedo aircraft. The Americans are still having problems with their torpedoes. They left behind 3 infernos. The fuel in each aircraft ignited. There were fires on deck. There were fires in the hangar. Each of these 3 aircraft had to be abandoned. And there's a photograph of the squadrons that did the damage, the first one anyway. Now, why did this happen? Well, Japan had led the world with radar in the 1930s, but they hadn't really grasped its full potential. Nagumo had no radar to give them the tactical picture or to make decisions in real time. He was constantly waiting for reports from scout aircraft, which had to land on to let him know what was going on, and which they were often late, or the information itself was wrong or been overtaken by events. Now that leaves 1 carrier still at sea undamaged. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi is the commander of the 1st Carrier Strike Force. He was undeterred by the fate of Akagi, Kaga, and Tsuru, and he held his course in Hiru for the expected location of the American carriers. He launched his own airstrike against them. He knew that he was now facing 3 carriers, and he knew one of them was Yorktown. He was a very able and daring commander. Although taken aback by the news, he was determined to continue on and attack the Americans. And there's Yorktown, under attack from the surviving carrier. 36 aircraft got into the sky, 7 got through Yorktown's fighter protection and went in, and 4 enemy bombers made 3 direct hits. Yorktown was on fire internally after a Japanese bomb went down a smokestack. She was now highly vulnerable to attack. Fletcher, whose flagship it was, passed all carrier commands to Spruance, and he himself moved across to the heavy cruiser Astoria, which would of course later be lost a couple of weeks, 3 weeks later at the Battle of Savo Island. Now, he passed to Spruance. We haven't heard of Spruance yet. There's Spruance. He launched Wildcats from Enterprise to strike Hiryu before Yamaguchi could strike at Enterprise. That was a determined, deliberate, and wise action. Offensive action was needed to avoid disaster. Otherwise, the other carriers could have been hit as Yorktown had been hit. Spruance made exactly the right decision when it was needed. High speed and accurate decision-making without waiting for more intelligence were vital, and offensive action was needed to avoid this disaster. The right decision at the right time. Then there was a final attack on Yorktown. Yamaguchi launched his last torpedo bombers and Zero fighters shortly after 12:45. He thought that Yorktown was already out of action. He thought he was attacking a second carrier. Yorktown's gunners, who were still in action, fired an intense barrage of anti-aircraft fire. There were 11 Japanese bombers shot down by fighters and from the deck before their bombs were dropped. Very successful in terms of anti-aircraft fire from a crippled and burning carrier. One has to have great admiration for those anti-aircraft gunners on Yorktown's deck. But of course, if she couldn't be saved, she was listing heavily from the torpedoes the Japanese got into her. and she had to be abandoned. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, the captain, became concerned that Yorktown would just capsize. She'd gone to 26 degrees of list, and of course the risk was that everybody would drown with her. So he ordered his crew to abandon ship. Destroyers stood by and came in and rescued the surviving crew, and that was very significant. At that moment, there were 40 dauntless dive bombers in the air that found Haruyu, and at 17:03, late in the afternoon on the 4th of June, they devastated her. Spruance was determined to ensure that she didn't escape unscathed, and the sun was behind them, and without the benefit of radar, the Japanese failed to detect the American bombers until they were on them. And by this stage, the Army B-17s from Midway are also attacking all the crippled and burning ships, and they're finally getting their aim right, and they're doing more devastation to all 4 of the carriers. So just before sunset, Midway finally lives up to its potential and attacks the severely crippled and burning ships. The smoke, of course, guided the bombers right to them. And 3 hits were scored on Akagi, 1 on Haruyu, and 1 on a cruiser, which left it burning. 1 destroyer was also damaged. There's Akagi turning, as photographed from a flying fortress, which was bombing it. She's maneuvering, but of course the heavy payload of the flying fortresses just devastated her. 5 dive bombers came in again, and Haruyu was obviously in deep trouble, and the order was given to abandon ship. She became a floating cauldron of exploding gasoline. Yamaguchi ordered his crew to abandon ship at 0230 on the 5th of June. He personally refused to leave her and died in his ship. He was a very able Japanese commander, very much needed for the continuation of the carrier war, and from the Japanese point of view, his loss was a disaster. He elected to remain and die with the ship and ordered torpedoes in to sink her from Japanese destroyers. Very serious loss to the IJN. So the Japanese torpedoes were fired and they sank the crippled ship. So 4 IJN carriers sunk, comprised 2/3 of Japan's total numbers of fleet carriers, the big ones, and the experienced core of the first air fleet went with them. The carriers were not immediately removed from the Navy list. Instead, they were listed through until September as unmanned. The humiliation and the devastation were just too late, just too great. Survivors were picked up. There are Japanese survivors from Haruyu as USN POWs on deck. And of course, the psychological blow to Japan was just about irrecoverable. There's the heavy cruiser Makuma, gutted by B-26 bombs. You see her there before and after. And of course, Spruance is the man of the match. Fletcher is not on the scene on a carrier anymore. Spruance saved the victory by keeping clear of Yamamoto's battleship fleet of 7 battleships and battle cruisers. Having lost Yorktown, he decided to turn eastward. Yamamoto was not prepared to follow him all the way back to Pearl Harbor and risk the battle fleet, and so the battle is discontinued. It was good sense and caution by Spruance that prevented an American victory turning into a defeat. He decided it was better to fight again another day. And it's very important to realize when the moment comes to capitalize on your victory, to cash in your chips. In 2 days, Nimitz's aviators and the US Army Air Corps, against the odds, had gained mastery of the air in the region of Midway. And they would take that confidence on to Guadalcanal. There were terrible losses still to come for the Americans and for ourselves, particularly at Savo Island. But the pattern had been set. American aircraft could get into the air in time, they could use good intelligence, and they could take down the formerly invincible Japanese Air Force and carrier air battle. Yamamoto's estimation of the responsibility for defeat, his worst fears had come true. He'd planned an ambush and he'd been caught in it. Poor planning, poor execution. The US won all the battles all over the Pacific after this in due course. And Yamamoto knew what the future was going to be. He'd predicted it. He said, "I am the only officer who must apologize to the emperor," when he was asked how this was going to be explained by his subordinate commanders. Not only the aircraft and pilots, but the air mechanics were lost. And that was a very significant loss. You can't train people up to repair, refuel, rearm aircraft in hangars overnight. It just doesn't happen. So Japan would have limited successes, as I just said, Savo Island, for example, but no more great campaigns. Yamamoto's prediction that success would only last for 6 months came true almost to the day. Japanese industry supporting the war had no time or materials to rebuild such a carrier fleet that had been built over a decade in peacetime and lost in 24 hours. Yamamoto's decision to set a trap at Midway brought forward the decisive battle he wanted, but it cost Japan the carriers and their aircraft. So how do we compare the two? Nimitz had tactical foresight enabled by code breaking and wise use of intelligence. Yamamoto, his planning was based on false assumptions. The plan was good in theory, it failed in practice. What happened to Yamamoto? Well, of course, in 1943, the Americans designed an operation specifically to kill him, based on an accurate intelligence on his aircraft's itinerary. And there's him giving his last salute the day he was shot down and killed. Yorktown and Lexington, and to a lesser extent Enterprise, were quickly made good in terms of losses by the new Essex-class carriers. Yes, Yorktown and Lexington were on the bottom of the ocean, but there were carriers coming out of American yards apace. And that was, of course, the significant difference, because the American carriers were bigger, more capable, and the aircraft flying from them were better than the Japanese aircraft late in the war. Spruance goes on to be the man of the match, working hand in glove with Nimitz. He says, "A man's judgment is best when he can forget himself and any reputation he may have acquired and can concentrate solely on making the right decisions." That should be up in every junior officer's lecture room. It's a great quote. He becomes the deputy commander for Nimitz from 41 to 45. At the Battle of the Philippines, his aircraft sank 3 more Japanese carriers and 2 oilers and destroyed about another 600 enemy aircraft and broke the back of the Japanese Navy. And of course, he was still in command at the last great battle at Okinawa. Fletcher did well, but Spruance's performance at Midway was superb, calm, collected, decisive, yet receptive to advice, keeping his mind in play with the widely disparate nature of forces and boldly seizing opportunities. He emerged from the battle as one of the greatest American admirals in American naval history, according to the doyen, Samuel Eliot Morrison. You can't get higher praise than that. There's Nimitz briefing Roosevelt and MacArthur on future operations after Midway. There's the plan for the Japanese after they'd taken Midway, and the reality, of course, is entirely different, because the 2 green lines there show you what will actually happen. Forces will come up from the Coral Sea, up through Midway, up through the Philippines, and of course all the way on to Okinawa, and another force will come across and past Guam, and of course the great battles of the Central Pacific. Churchill had this to say: "The annals of war at sea present no more intense, heart-shaking shock than this battle, in which the qualities of the United States Navy and the American race shone forth in splendor. The bravery and devotion of the American airmen and sailors and the nerve and skill of their leaders was the foundation of all." You can't get a much more Churchillian quote than that. The Americans got to the point where they didn't need every carrier they had, and the older carriers could be alongside back in Pearl and back in California, whereas the Japanese could not replace their carriers. There's the Amagi, one of their last carriers, capsized after being bombed in Kure Harbor in 1946. Now, I can't go into any more great detail, so we can get to this point on board at the surrender. And there's the Japanese delegation on board Missouri to sign the surrender delegation in September 45. It was intelligence demonstrated first at Coral Sea, then at Midway, which remained highly relevant to the capacity of the Americans to outthink, outwit, and innovate the Japanese all the way through. And that underlying principle, that message, remains true today as it was back in 1941-42. There's Chester Nimitz signing the instrument of surrender on board Missouri in August 45, watched over by the figure of MacArthur. Yorktown, we know where she is. She's a war grave. Robert Ballard found her. She's upright, still at about 26 degrees list. She's a war grave, of course. There's the anti-aircraft gunners there who defended her so ably. And of course, all over the central area of the Pacific near Midway, there are Japanese and American aircraft on the bottom in clear water. There's one of Yorktown's lost devastators. Lessons there for us all about only ever using the best equipment and best aircraft you have. Don't assume that the enemy won't be able to deal with anything that's less than the best. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. There's a crew of a carrier with airmen and others lined up in their coffins. War is not cheap, it's not necessary, and we need to avoid it. The victory was achieved, a terrible loss to the Japanese, a significant loss to the Americans, and it was a victory not just of the tactical, but at the strategic level. So I'm now open for questions.
Desmond, I would like to congratulate you on a first-class talk. I'm the descendant of Jack Crace. He was my great uncle.
Yes.
And one of the problems always after the war was there was never any memorial to the Battle of the Coral Sea until 2012, when the suburb of Crace was built and the developers very kindly put in a development. Thank you.
We now not only have a memorial there, but we have a township, a suburb of Canberra called Crace.
Yes, and of course the next door suburb of Gungahlin was where he actually grew up.
That's right. Yes, a very great officer.
So yes, and he spoke very highly of Captain Bodie's handling, and Bodie spoke very highly of Crace's handling during that Crace's chase, as it was known as, across the German Passage.
Very good. Good to see you online, James.
Thank you.
Desmond, if I may, firstly, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating presentation, and it's nice to see the history retold so well. I apologise, I did miss the first sort of 10 minutes of the presentation. Did you talk about the bombing of Townsville at all in the Battle of the Coral Sea, or could you maybe say a few words about that?
No, I didn't cover that because I restrict myself to maritime affairs. So no, I didn't touch on that. I talked a good deal about the bombing of Darwin, but I didn't go into detail about all the other raids that took place on Australia.
Was Townsville carrier launched? Do you know?
No, Townsville was never bombed by carriers. Townsville was bombed eventually from Rabaul later in the war. In fact, yes, it was later. The great authority on that is my friend Tom Lewis, who happens not to be online today because he's flying around Tasmania. But no, Townsville played no part in this battle, though Townsville was the port that the small number of Japanese who thought in terms of taking a port thought they might wish to take. But it really was always a bridge too far, as I explained earlier on. Togo would never have tolerated or permitted it.
I might, John McFarlane, I might just make a small comment, not relating to that magnificent presentation directly, Desmond, but just the significance of the Solomon Islands from a strategic point of view in the Battle of Coral Sea, and indeed in the massive land battle of Guadalcanal. Obviously, the Japanese did their homework and considered that if they could occupy the Solomon Islands and adjacent area, that would give them a massive strategic advantage against the American and, to a lesser extent, the Australian capabilities in the area. Well, now we've got a totally different, but nevertheless same geography with the problem of what's going to happen with the Solomon Islands and Chinese interests in that area. I won't develop that further. I think it takes it away from the main objective of this particular presentation, but just to remind people that the Solomon Islands remains strategically a very important area in the South Pacific. Thank you.
John, thank you very much for that. And one could add that New Caledonia was a Japanese target. Though we have no reason to believe that New Caledonia is ever going to be in hostile hands, its political future is uncertain, and we need to keep our eye on that as well.
Perhaps I could add one other small PS, and that is the Torres Strait was also bombed substantially during World War II, and the local people in the Torres Strait comprised the Torres Strait Infantry Battalion, which manned the anti-aircraft facilities in the Torres Strait, and did incredibly well, and is often overlooked when it comes to the defence of the attacks on northern and eastern Australia.
Chris Skinner, do you want to talk to us?
Yes. Firstly, absolutely a tour de force of the presentation. So thank you very much indeed, Desmond. My question is a sort of an odd one. In some of the battles, you talked about the effectiveness of the flak, the anti-aircraft fire from all ships. Can you enlarge on that a little bit? And you know, how was it? How did it improve? How was it developed? Were there any special sort of types of ammunition or other facilities that assisted in that regard? You know, we hear a lot about aircraft on aircraft and so on, but what about the defensive weapons?
Well, indeed, and you take me down to a level of technicality that I probably can't help you much with, Chris, and there may even be people online who might know a good deal more about it. But fairly evidently, during the 1930s, it became obvious that what you wanted to do was to fill the air with shrapnel, not just have a single munition, because a single munition can miss, and that's that. Whereas if you can get multi-barreled aircraft putting up large amounts of aircraft of ammunition in the same general area, you have a much better chance of inflicting some serious damage on a fuselage, on a pilot, on an aircraft's engine, or on a fuel tank, all of the above. And but nothing was ever perfect. I mean, one remembers seeing video of the sheer amount of flak that the Americans used to put up against the kamikazes in 44 and 45. And yes, they got a lot of them, but you know, just as they used to say, the bomber will always get through, the kamikaze will always get through. One of them will get through. And that's, for example, what devastated the USS Franklin. I remember seeing video imaging of that. The British were undergunned at the beginning of the war, and they kept acquiring from the Americans good replacement anti-aircraft armaments from them in order to give themselves a fighting chance. I mean, you think about Pedestal, the operation to get USS, the Ohio through to Malta, the quantity of flak that the British were putting up against the incoming Italian and German aircraft was phenomenal. But brave pilots will always do it. And while we're on the subject of brave pilots, we remember the courage of the Devastator bombers who just kept flying on while watching friend after friend being shot out of the sky around them. Enormous courage. Whether it was tactically wise to do so is another matter. But one must also admire the courage of the Japanese pilots who showed equal determination to press home their attacks through flak coming up from the American carriers, both at Coral Sea and at Midway. And now for the first time I can see Patricia. Hello, Patricia.
I'm just unmuting myself.
Thank you. Yes, we can talk now. Lovely to see you, Patricia.
Thank you, Desmond, for that. I did send you messages on the chat.
Okay. I'll look at those shortly. Yes, I was a bit distracted by giving the presentation.
Yes,
I remember,
you were very, very busy.
I remember very well taking you along to the museum at the Naval College and seeing your father's sword and medals on the wall.
And thank you for reminding me of all of that. It
Yes.
happened a while ago now.
Yes, of course, when he lost his life, he wouldn't have had any medals because it was too early in the war for medals to have been issued. So those medals were the medals he would have received had he lived to through the war.
Yes, and thank you very much for that. I am now going to have my supper.
Rob, if you don't know, is the archivist at the Sea Power Centre Australia at Fishwick. And if you've got any questions relating to materials, Rob is the man to go to. He knows it all, and he's got it all at his fingertips. One of the great assets of the Navy.
Oh, thank you very much for your kind words, Desmond. We just just jumped on to congratulate you that we were listening in. It was absolutely fantastic. Peter's here as well, so bravo, well done.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, Peter.
Well done, Des.